A little after midnight, in the east corridor of the oldest private club in Providence, a 28-year-old waitress named Delilah Rourke was sitting on the floor because she couldn't get up. Her crutch was lying a few feet away, on the same side of the fire door she'd just bolted shut, close enough to look at and too far to reach, because a man had knocked it out of her hand and then walked it along the floorboards with the toe of his shoe, slowly, a foot at a time, while she dragged herself after it. Her left arm was pressed uselessly against her chest, tight in its leather brace, and the scarred fingers extending from her sleeve wouldn't stop shaking. Outside, the blizzard had shut down the highway. Inside, somewhere above her head, a man was going through a ring of keys, and he'd just told her, in a very calm voice, exactly how much time she had left. She noticed something else, too, lying there in the cold. The night watchman wasn't at his post. Somebody had sent him home early. She called 911. The weather had the whole state locked down, they told her, and the nearest car was the better part of an hour out. She'd called the police from inside this building once before, and nothing had ever come of it. She didn't have a brother. She didn't have a sister. There wasn't a single person in that city who'd pick up the phone for her at that hour. So she pulled out her wallet, and behind a photograph of her mother there was a black card with no name on it. Nothing but a phone number, handed to her one night the autumn before by a man she had served exactly once and never asked a single question about. Every other person in that building knew who he was. She didn't. She pressed the number anyway. It rang one time, and a woman who'd spent years apologizing for taking up room in a place said 5 words into a cracked phone. "Can you come get me?" There was a pause on the other end, about the length of one breath. Then the line went dead. 19 minutes later, in the middle of a blizzard, the iron gates of the Renfield Club came off their stone pillars, and Salvatore Cardinale walked in through the snow. And what he did first, before he said a single word to anybody standing in that hallway, wasn't what any of them were expecting. If this has already got hold of you, leave a like. It truly helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Share it with someone who believes that the way we treat the people serving us says everything about who we are. And subscribe with notifications on, because this one is only getting started. Now let's go back to that corridor, and to the 19 minutes that changed both of their lives. In Barrington, about half an hour's drive to the south, 7 middle-aged men sat around a long table in a room with walnut-paneled walls and a fire burning in the hearth, discussing the cargo handling contracts at the harbor for the coming spring. None of them spoke loudly. It was the kind of room where no one needed to raise his voice. Salvatore Cardinale sat at the head of the table with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, an untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold resting before him, and he was listening to a man named Bell explain the matter of fuel prices when the phone lying face down beside his elbow began to vibrate. It wasn't the phone he used for business. It was the other one, the model whose number he had given to only one person in his entire life, and that person had never called. He picked it up, and Bell managed another half a sentence before realizing that the entire room had fallen silent. Sal pressed the phone to his ear. He didn't say his name. He only listened. From the other end came the sound of wind slipping through a gap in a door, the breathing of someone struggling not to cry aloud, and 5 words spoken so softly that he had to close his eyes to hear them clearly. He asked where she was inside that building. She answered. He asked what kind of lock was securing her door. She answered. That was all he asked. Then he ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table, exactly as it had been before. No one in the room knew what he had just heard, but every one of them saw his face, and that was what made Bell fall completely silent. What made the man beside Bell instinctively slide his chair back half a handspan. What made the coffee cup on the table suddenly seem like the only thing in the room still daring enough to make a sound when it touched its saucer with a faint clink. Sal rose. He didn't roll his sleeves back down. He turned to the man leaning against the wall near the door, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, who had stood in that exact place in rooms like this one for more years than anyone cared to count, and he said 3 words. "Bring the car." Gino nodded and left at once. He didn't ask which car. He didn't ask where they were going, but at the far end of the table, Frank Del Vecchio placed both hands on the polished wood and stood. Del Vecchio was the oldest man in the room, the only one there who had once carried Sal in his arms before the boy had learned to walk, the only one permitted to call him by the shortened name his mother had once used, and the only man alive who dared to stand between him and a door. He didn't raise his voice. He said the storm outside was closing down the entire state, that the freeway had been closed since dusk. He said it had been a very long time since Sal had personally gone out to handle anything, that there was a whole line of men ready to go in his place, that all he had to do was speak a name, and the matter would be finished before dawn, and that a man in his position shouldn't be present where the trouble was unfolding. He said all of it in the voice of an uncle who was genuinely worried for his nephew, because that was exactly what everyone in the room, including Sal, believed they were hearing. Sal paused for a moment. He looked at Del Vecchio, and for one very brief instant, something in his eyes almost softened. Then he kept walking. He passed the old man standing across his path, moving so close that their shoulders brushed, and went by him as though Del Vecchio were nothing more than a chair that had been left in the wrong place inside his own home. There was no explanation, not a single glance back. The door closed behind him, leaving 7 men sitting in silence, none of them daring to be the first to speak. Downstairs, the gates to the estate hadn't fully opened before the car shot through them, throwing snow to either side like 2 breaking waves. The electronic sign at the freeway entrance flashed a warning that the road was closed. Sal didn't slow down. He turned sharply to the right and took the road along the bay, a narrow, dark stretch of pavement winding beside the water, a road no sane person would have chosen on a night like this, and pressed his foot down. No one inside the car said a word. Gino sat on the right with both hands resting on his thighs, watching the clock on the dashboard. The minute hand had just moved forward another mark. The fire door stood at the exact center of the east corridor, separating the members' section from the staff area, and on both sides lay the same old oak flooring, the same deep golden brown polished by the passage of countless winters. When the crutch was knocked from her hand, it didn't remain where it fell. It slid away, struck the baseboard, then was pushed farther, carrying it through the open doorway and across to the other side, into the stretch of corridor where no member had ever set foot. Delilah dragged herself after it. She couldn't think of anything except getting through that doorway. And she did, using her right arm, her right knee, and a kind of will she hadn't known she still possessed. She reached up, caught hold of the latch, and pulled it across. The bolt slid into place with a dry, clean click, a very small sound, and it was the last sound she had enough strength to make. Then she lowered herself to the floor. The crutch lay about 2 ordinary strides away, leaning at an angle against the baseboard, its worn rubber handle turned toward her like an outstretched hand. She could see it with perfect clarity. The light from the wall fixture fell brightly enough for her to make out the long scratch along the aluminum shaft, a mark so familiar that she could have drawn it from memory. For the next 19 minutes, she lay there staring at it, unable to reach it. And of everything that night did to her, that was what she would remember the longest. The cold rose from the wooden floor first, and only then did the cold begin seeping through the gap beneath the door. It passed through the thin fabric of her uniform, settling into her hip, her shoulder blade, and the place between 2 ribs where every breath brought a brief, sharp stab of pain. Her left arm, stiff and scarred from that long-ago fire, rested diagonally across her chest, useless and as heavy as a piece of firewood someone had tied to her body, while her damaged fingers trembled in waves, not from pain but from cold, or perhaps from both. She couldn't tell anymore. She tried pressing her right hand against the floor to push herself up. She managed to rise about a handspan. Her left leg wouldn't bear her weight. It never had, not since that summer. But tonight, it was worse than usual. And when she tried to shift her weight onto it, her entire body tipped sideways, like a table with a broken leg, and she sank back down. She lay still, breathing, and allowed the memory to come because there was nothing else left for her to do. That summer, she had already made it out to the sidewalk. She had stood there among neighbors dressed in their nightclothes, their bare feet planted on asphalt that was still warm, and counted the windows on the 3rd floor without seeing her mother in any of them. Someone had taken her hand. She had pulled free and gone back inside. Later, people told her the stairs had still been passable then, that if she had moved a little faster, things might have ended differently, but she didn't believe she had been slow. She only remembered finding her mother in the 3rd floor corridor near the fire escape, remembered that her mother could no longer walk, and that Delilah had carried her halfway down the stairs before the ceiling collapsed. Her mother survived. That was the only thing Delilah ever said to anyone who asked about it, and she said it in the voice of someone who had answered the same question too many times. Her mother survived, while Delilah carried away that leg, that hand, and a question she had never dared ask anyone, not even her mother. not even herself in the privacy of her own mind, during the longest nights. It was a question of 4 words, one she had always smothered before it could fully take shape. Lying on the cold wooden floor, she finally allowed it to form. Was it worth it? And then, at that exact moment, another thought intruded. Something small and entirely removed from everything else, the kind of thought that comes only when the mind has exhausted itself and begins gathering whatever scraps it can find. She remembered that when she had crossed the front lobby at the beginning of her shift, the chair inside the guard booth had been empty. No one had been sitting there. Otis hadn't been at his post. He sat there every night, with a thermos of tea beside his right hand during the winter, and he always remained until the last person had left the building. But not tonight. Tonight, he had been sent home early. Since the fall 2 years earlier, when she began working at the Renfield Club, Delilah had developed her own way of surviving inside that building, and it consisted entirely of things so small that no one noticed them. She always arrived well before her shift began. Not because she was diligent, but because she moved slowly. And she didn't want anyone waiting for her at the staff entrance, didn't want anyone watching her drag herself across the parking lot and then asking whether she needed help. She arrived early, changed early, and by the time the others came in, she was already standing at her station. She propped her crutch behind the storeroom door, in a hidden corner where the open door concealed it completely. She didn't touch it for the entire shift. She had learned to carry a tray with one hand, keeping her right wrist rigid and letting all the weight rest along her forearm. She had learned to brace her hip against the edge of a table while pouring water so she wouldn't need to place a hand on its surface. Learned to turn on her right heel instead of taking a step. Learned to remain standing for long periods by pressing her left knee against a table leg to keep it from buckling. Several winters passed before she could do all of those things smoothly. And what made her proudest, the one thing she had never told anyone, was that eventually not a single member in that dining room noticed what she was doing. The shift manager had spoken to her once, during her first week, telling her not to cross the main lobby whenever guests were present. He had said it in the kindly voice of a man who believed he was sparing her embarrassment. From that night on, she took the long way around through the kitchen, down the service corridor, through the linen room, out the side door, and then entered the dining room from the rear, a route several times longer than the direct one. She walked that way every night for 2 seasons without uttering a single complaint, because at the end of every month, a payment still had to be sent, and that payment was what kept her mother's bed at Glenmore. That was the simplest reason, and it was the only one. She had applied all over the city, sending applications from one place to another, and people looked at the crutch before they looked at her face, then told her they would be in touch. Only one place ever called her back. Marisol Vega, the kitchen assistant who worked the night shift with her, was the only person in that building who called Delilah by her name instead of her job title. One night in late fall, after Delilah had stood motionless in the linen room for nearly half a minute, waiting for the trembling in her hand to subside, Marisol pushed open the door, looked at her, and said she should quit. That there were other places, that those people weren't worth all the humiliation she endured in silence. Delilah wiped her hands on her apron and replied in an entirely ordinary voice that Marisol was right, but the other places hadn't called her back, and her mother would still need that bed next month. Marisol said nothing more. There was nothing anyone could say after a sentence like that, but later that same night, while the two of them were clearing the dining room, Delilah stopped beside the table near the south window, the finest table in the room, with a view of the row of trees and the old stone wall, and realized something she had vaguely noticed for a long time, without ever giving it a name. Table 12 was always polished, always given fresh flowers, always fully set with silverware, and always empty. No guests were ever seated there. She had seen the manager turn away even long-time members, even familiar faces who never needed reservations, and they didn't argue. They simply nodded and sat somewhere else. She asked Marisol why. Marisol was folding napkins, and she didn't look up. She only told Delilah not to ask about it, then began folding the next napkin, and the conversation ended there. South of Providence, the car turned away from the closed freeway entrance and raced down the road along the bay. The snow was so thick that the twin beams of the headlights reached only a few meters ahead before dissolving into a solid wall of white. The edge of the water couldn't be seen. The markings on the road couldn't be seen. Sal didn't slow down. Then, one night in the middle of November the previous year, someone was sitting at that table. Delilah was carrying dishes to the other side when she saw him, and she nearly dropped the entire tray. A man sat alone at table 12, facing the window, his coat draped over the back of the chair beside him, and no one in the dining room seemed surprised. The shift manager personally went to take his order, standing straighter than Delilah had ever seen him stand before any other member. The man ordered something that wasn't on the menu, an old-fashioned soup made with beans and an herb the kitchen never kept in stock. Delilah stood at the service window and listened as the head chef accepted the order without asking a single question. He cooked it himself, ladled it into the bowl himself, wiped the rim with a clean cloth himself, and throughout the entire process, no one in the kitchen opened his mouth to ask why. The bowl of soup was carried out. The man thanked them. Then he sat there for nearly the entire evening, gazing through the window without touching so much as a single spoonful. On the other side of the dining room, a member who had drunk a little too much called Delilah over to refill his water. She approached, braced her hip against the edge of the table exactly as she had trained herself to do. And just as she finished pouring, he reached out and knocked his wineglass onto the floor. It didn't fall. He knocked it down. She clearly saw the movement of his wrist. Then he loudly summoned the manager and said he wanted another server, that watching her move around his table had destroyed his appetite. Delilah knelt. Of everything she had to do in that place, kneeling was the hardest, because getting down was easy, but rising again wasn't, and she gathered every shard of glass into a cloth, blotted the wine spreading across the carpet, then had to reach for the leg of a chair and pull herself upright while everyone at the table watched. She apologized 3 times, once to the member, once to the manager, and once more to the very air in the room, that final apology escaping her lips like a reflex she couldn't control. No one stood to help her. At table 12, the man had turned his head. He didn't rise, didn't speak, didn't call anyone over. He only watched, and he watched from beginning to end without looking away for even a second, not even after she had managed to stand and disappeared through the kitchen door. At the end of her shift, when she left through the service entrance at the side of the building, he was standing beneath the awning while rain fell beyond it. He didn't ask what was wrong with her leg. He said nothing about what had happened in the dining room. His face didn't carry the expression she knew too well, that softening around the eyes people gave her, and then mistook for kindness. He asked her only one question. He asked what she was apologizing for. Delilah opened her mouth. She had lived for 28 years, and she couldn't find a single word with which to answer him. She closed it again. The man nodded once, as though that was exactly the answer he had been waiting for, then drew a black card from the inside pocket of his coat and handed it to her. There was no name on it, only a string of numbers. He told her that the people in this building had forgotten how to treat another human being a long time ago, and that if there ever came a night when they forgot so completely that it became dangerous, she was to call that number, no matter the hour. Then he walked toward his car. A man was already waiting in the rain, his hat held in his hands, saying something about a payment that had come due and asking for more time. Sal listened for about 10 seconds, then said one word, "Friday." The man thanked him 3 times and backed away from the path. Inside the car, Gino asked who the waitress was. Sal looked through the rain-streaked window and said that she had left something unfinished. Tonight, on the road along the bay, Gino asked whether he should call ahead and have men waiting. Sal said no. "I'll handle this myself." She heard him coming down the stairs before she heard his footsteps stop on the other side of the steel door. He didn't pound on it. He didn't test the bolt. He only stood there. And when he spoke, his voice sounded so ordinary that for one brief moment she thought someone else had arrived, someone who had come to help her. That was the most frightening thing about the entire night, more frightening even than the sound of her crutch sliding across the wooden floor. He spoke through the gap in the door as casually as someone talking across a dinner table. He said she could keep lying there, that he wasn't in any hurry. He said he had gone to get the key and was holding it in his hand, and that she had about that much time left. The number he gave was so small that it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a simple piece of information. Then he began saying other things. He said she had no one, no brother, no sister, no husband, not a single friend except that woman who worked in the kitchen, and even she didn't dare open her mouth to defend Delilah. He said everything slowed down wherever she went, that the entire dining room had to wait for her to cross from one end to the other, that people had tolerated her for 2 whole seasons out of kindness, and she had never understood that. He said it wouldn't matter whom she called, that the storm outside was swallowing the entire state, that there wasn't a single person in the world who would drive through weather like that to come for someone like her. Delilah lay motionless on the floor, and listened to every word. She covered her ear with her uninjured hand, but it did no good, because what truly broke her wasn't his voice. What truly broke her was realizing that he was reading aloud, word by word, the very voice that spoke inside her head every night when she returned to her apartment in Olneyville and sat on the edge of her bed. He hadn't invented anything new. He was merely giving voice to the things she had been telling herself for years. Then she heard another sound from above, on the main staircase. The sound of heels against wood, slow, even, unhurried. Delilah knew those footsteps. Everyone in the building knew those footsteps. She braced herself on her right elbow, pushed her body a few centimeters off the floor, and called out. She called the woman's name. She called louder than she had thought she was still capable of calling, her voice breaking at the end. She called for Mrs. Whitmore and said the door was bolted, asked her to open it, begged her. Please. The footsteps stopped. Several seconds of silence followed, and during those seconds, Delilah lay listening to the pounding of her own heart and believed, truly believed, that this was about to end. Then, Camille Whitmore spoke. She didn't speak to Delilah. She spoke down the stairs to her son in the same flat voice she used when reading the menu to guests at the annual banquet. Chandler, don't ruin the carpet. When you're finished, tell the driver to take her home. The heels began clicking again, and this time the sound receded, crossing the landing, continuing up the rest of the staircase, then disappearing completely into the inner rooms of the house. Delilah lowered herself to the floor again. She didn't cry. Something inside her chest had just closed very softly, like a door shutting without anyone hearing it, and with a strange and perfect calm. She thought that there truly was no one after all. On the other side of the steel door came the sound of metal touching metal, the sound of someone searching through a ring of keys one by one, then the sound of a key entering the lock. And at that exact second, from somewhere beyond the front grounds, cutting through the wind and penetrating several layers of the old building's walls, a siren began to scream. The iron gates of the Renfield Club had stood between those two stone pillars since before the building had electricity, and they were torn away from those pillars in less than a second, taking with them a section of stone ripped free from the mortar. In the corridor, Chandler spun around, the ring of keys still lodged halfway into the lock. He heard the front door being forced open, heard the wind rushing into the lobby, then heard footsteps crossing the wooden floor, and that was what struck him as strange, because those footsteps weren't hurried. They were steady, moving no faster than a man walking through the hallway of his own home, and they kept drawing closer. Salvatore Cardinale emerged from the darkness at the end of the corridor, snow still resting on both shoulders of his coat and slowly melting into dark streaks. He didn't look around. He wasn't searching for anything. Chandler pulled the keys from the lock, clenched them in his fist, and let out a laugh, the laugh of a man accustomed to everything in that building revolving around him. He demanded to know who Sal was. He said this was private property. He asked whether Sal knew whose son he was. Sal didn't answer. He merely tilted his head slightly to one side, and Gino, who had just entered behind him, settled the matter cleanly in the space of a single breath. Sal didn't look down at the floor even once. He stood there with his hands still in the pockets of his coat and looked toward the top of the staircase, where Camille Whitmore had just appeared, one hand gripping the banister, her hair still perfectly arranged in its bun. She looked down the corridor, looked at her son, then looked at the man standing in the middle of her own hallway, and she opened her mouth to say something. Perhaps it was a question. Perhaps it was a threat. She had spent her entire life in rooms where a single sentence from her had always been enough. Sal spoke first. He said a name, a woman's name, 2 words, pronounced clearly and slowly enough for the entire corridor to hear. Then he asked whether she remembered. Camille stood at the top of the staircase and said nothing. She frowned. She genuinely tried to remember. It was visible on her face, the effort of someone searching through her memory for something she had never considered worth keeping. Then she shook her head, a very small movement, almost an apologetic gesture, the kind people offered in response to a meaningless name. It was the worst answer she could possibly have given, and she had no idea. Sal watched her for another moment. Then he said that before dawn, she would remember, and so would the entire city. She didn't understand what he meant. She wouldn't understand until the following morning. Sal turned away. He said nothing else to her, nothing to Gino, nothing to the man lying on the corridor floor behind him. He continued down the full length of the east corridor, passing the steel door that remained bolted, moving deeper into the hallway beyond it, where the wall lights cast their glow across an empty stretch of wooden floor. There, leaning at an angle against the baseboard, was the crutch. He stopped before it. Then that man, the same man who only minutes earlier hadn't considered it worth lowering his head to look at the floor, bent down and picked it up. He held it in both hands. Snow clung to its lower tip, snow that had been dragged in through the side entrance on Chandler's shoes, and several tiny shards of glass were caught against the rubber covering the handle, fragments left behind where the tray had fallen. Sal brushed them away slowly and carefully, like someone cleaning an object that belonged to another person and had been entrusted to his care. Then he tucked the crutch beneath his arm and turned back toward the steel door. By the time the patrol cars arrived, everything had been over for a long while, and in the report from that night, the alarm at the Renfield Club was recorded as a false alarm caused by the weather. The bolt was drawn back from the other side. The steel door opened inward, slowly, and warmer air from the main corridor flowed across the threshold. Delilah heard the hinges move, and her body did what it had learned to do over the past 2 seasons. She curled herself against the baseboard, drew up her right knee, and raised both arms over her head, including the one in the cast, even though it couldn't protect her from anything. She didn't look up. She didn't know who was standing in the doorway, and in that moment it didn't matter, because inside this building every set of footsteps had become the same set of footsteps. She was as afraid of the person who had opened the door as she had been of the person who had locked it. Nothing happened. No one shouted. No one came toward her. Then she heard the soft rustle of fabric, the sound of a knee touching the wooden floor, and a breath released from very low down, at the same level as hers. Sal knelt 2 strides away from her. He didn't come any closer. He settled back on his heels with both hands resting on his thighs, and he called her name. He used her full name, not the shortened version everyone in the building called her. Delilah didn't move. He didn't call her again. He simply reached out and propped the crutch against the baseboard beside her, close enough that she needed only to lower one hand to touch its handle. Then he withdrew his hand. He returned to her the right to stand on her own, before he gave her anything else back. She lowered her arms. She saw the crutch first, and only then did she see him. She recognized him. She reached out with her right hand, gripped the handle, and tried to push herself upright. She had made it halfway when her left foot slipped against the wooden floor, and she fell back down harder than she meant to. She lay there, breathing. Then she spoke, very softly, the words barely carrying any sound. She asked him not to carry her. She said she was very heavy. She said her hand was dirty, and she begged him not to touch her left arm. During her 2 seasons in that building, and throughout the years before them, she had learned that it was better to say those things first than to make other people think of them on their own. Sal said nothing for a while. Then he moved a little closer, reached out, and took hold of that exact arm. He held the hand protruding from the plaster, the hand with the trembling fingers, and kept it within his own. He did it slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. He said that this hand had pulled her mother out of a fire. He said that in this entire building, it was the only thing that was clean. Delilah began to cry. She cried aloud, releasing the kind of sobs she hadn't permitted herself to make all night. Not when the crutch had been pushed away one handspan at a time. Not when the chairwoman's voice had drifted down from the top of the staircase. She wasn't crying because of the pain. She was crying because no one had held that hand in years. People looked at it, or they deliberately looked away, and both felt exactly the same. She had worn gloves for 2 seasons in this place. Sal remained still, holding her hand, and allowing her to cry until there were no tears left. He didn't say another word. When her sobs had finally subsided, he removed his coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, and drew the 2 sides together to cover the cast completely. Then he slipped one arm beneath her knees, placed the other behind her back, and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he had expected. He didn't say so. Before turning away, he reached for the crutch leaning against the baseboard and tucked it beneath his arm. He didn't leave it behind. The house in Barrington stood at the end of a long driveway without a sign, and by the time the car stopped, someone was already holding the door open. Dr. Beatrice Lanning was waiting in a room on the ground floor, her sleeves rolled up and her instruments arranged on a table covered with a white cloth. She didn't ask what had happened. She merely looked Delilah over from head to toe and told them to set her down. But when she said they needed to remove some of her clothing so she could examine her ribs, Delilah clutched the 2 sides of the coat, wrapped around her, and shook her head. She asked the doctor not to turn on the ceiling light. She said it twice, her voice breaking the second time, and her uninjured hand trembled even harder than it had while she was lying on the corridor floor. Dr. Lanning stopped and didn't pressure her. Sal stood in the corner of the room without stepping outside. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, in the ordinary voice of a man simply stating a fact, he said that for years she had lived like a thief, stealing other people's air, apologizing for standing wherever she stood, apologizing for breathing in whatever room she entered. Then he told her that in this house, she didn't need anyone's permission to exist. He said nothing more. Delilah looked at him for a while, then released the sides of the coat. The examination was completed fairly quickly. There were several injuries around her ribs, a wound at her temple that needed stitches, a deep sprain in her weakened left wrist that needed a proper brace, and her left leg, which Dr. Lanning examined longer than all the other injuries combined. After the medication had carried Delilah into sleep, Dr. Lanning stepped into the corridor and said one thing to Sal. She told him that Delilah had been using the wrong kind of crutch for years. It was the wrong size, the wrong height, and even had the wrong kind of handle for someone with a left hand like hers. She said someone had given Delilah the cheapest one in the catalog while she was still in the hospital, and no one had checked it since. She said most of the pain in Delilah's shoulder and hip came from the crutch, not from the old injury. Then she went back inside. Sal remained in the corridor for a long time after she had disappeared. The following morning, Delilah woke in a room with a window overlooking the bay, and the first thing she saw was a crutch standing beside the bed. It wasn't hers. The dark aluminum shaft had no scratches. The leather-covered handle had been shaped by someone to fit a small hand, and the height had already been adjusted so precisely that when she tried leaning on it, her shoulder didn't have to rise the way it had for all those years. There was no note attached. No one stood nearby waiting to see her reaction. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long while, then covered her face with her uninjured hand and wept, and this time she didn't know exactly what she was crying for either. Breakfast was served in the small dining room, and when she saw it, she began talking. She said there was too much, that she couldn't possibly eat all of it, that she needed only a little, that she was sorry someone had gone to so much trouble preparing everything. The words came without pause. Sal waited until she had finished. Then he pulled out a chair and told her to sit down and eat it all. She sat. She ate everything. That afternoon, while practicing several laps through the house to become accustomed to the new crutch, she passed the living room and stopped. In the corner, close to the inner wall, stood an old piano with its lid closed and a cloth draped over it, leaving only a row of keys visible, yellowed along the edges. She remained there a little longer than necessary, then continued on her way. The following afternoon, Delilah turned on the television in the living room, simply to hear the sound of human voices, and found herself watching a live news broadcast. On the screen was the front gate of the Renfield Club, filmed from across the street, with a strip of official ceiling tape stretched diagonally across the two wooden doors. Standing in the snow, the reporter said the club's operating license had been suspended that morning, that its personnel and workplace safety records were under investigation, and that the bank had just called in every loan held by the Whitmore family's construction company. The camera shifted toward a car waiting at the exit, its rear window sliding upward, and Delilah recognized the ringed hand resting against the window frame. She remained motionless until the broadcast moved on to the weather. Then she turned and looked at Sal, who was standing in the living room doorway with a cup of coffee in his hand. She didn't ask. He didn't say anything either. He took a sip and walked out. That same afternoon, not far away, 5 men sat around a round table in the basement of a long abandoned restaurant in Federal Hill, while Salvatore Cardinale stood in the center of the room. He had been summoned. That hadn't happened in more years than anyone cared to remember. The man seated opposite him explained the reason in the voice of someone reading from a rulebook. Sal had acted alone. He hadn't consulted anyone. He had brought down an entire family name in a single night, within shared territory, without asking a single question. And he had done all of it for an outsider. Frank Del Vecchio sat at the head of the table on the left, and he was the one who rose. He didn't raise his voice. He said he loved this boy like a son, that he had carried him in his arms before Sal could walk, and that this was precisely why he had to be the one to say it. Then he explained that the building sealed that morning was connected to a flow of money in which every man at the table had a share, that when official tape had been placed across those gates, a very large sum belonging to the entire family had become trapped behind them. and that he wanted the council to hear clearly the reason it had happened. He turned toward Sal. He said Sal had torn that money to pieces because of a waitress on a crutch. No one in the room spoke. Sal allowed those words to rest on the table for a while. Then he answered, and he said nothing about the night of the snowstorm, nothing about the corridor, not a single word about himself. He offered only one short sentence. "You know what my mother did in that building." Then he left it there. He didn't explain further, and he moved on to what he had truly come to say. He said they had spent their entire lives sitting in rooms like this and calling one another family. He said that if they still couldn't stop themselves when faced with someone who had no way to fight back, if the only thing that made them hesitate was a number written on a piece of paper, then they were no different from the people at the Renfield Club. They merely wore cheaper clothes. When he finished, he fell silent. The man seated opposite him called for a vote. It happened quickly, without debate. And when it was over, Sal had lost. The council withdrew its support from everything he did in connection with the matter, and declared that from that moment forward, whatever consequences arose would be his alone to bear. Del Vecchio was the first to rise. He walked around the table, placed one hand on Sal's shoulder, and gave it a gentle squeeze, the squeeze of an uncle, then left. The others followed one by one. Sal remained alone in the basement room among the chairs pushed out of place, and in all the years he had done this work, it was the first time he had ever stood alone. Ruth Feingold arrived in Barrington on a weekend morning, carrying a briefcase, and wearing the expression of someone who had decided to speak plainly from the moment she entered the door. She sat across from Delilah and delivered the news in the order she believed would be least shocking, though even that did nothing to soften it. The Whitmore family had filed a countersuit. They accused her of taking club property and injuring the owner's son on the night of the snowstorm. Delilah listened and couldn't understand how anyone could write such words on paper. Then Ruth opened the local newspaper and laid it on the table. Inside was a long article about Delilah, complete with a photograph, and beneath it were direct quotations from her treatment records. The therapy sessions in Cranston during the year she couldn't sleep. The doctor's notes that even she had never read again. Everything was there, printed on the page, accompanied by the words the newspaper had chosen to describe her mental condition. Delilah looked down and immediately recognized which records they were. They were the same pages she had copied one by one with her own hands at the machine in the Human Resources office, fastened together herself, and submitted herself in exchange for compensation after that night in the storage corridor. The paper she had signed to preserve her mother's bed was now being used to prove that her word couldn't be trusted. 3 days later, she sat in a conference room inside the Federal Building on Kennedy Plaza, with Ruth on her left. 2 people sat across from her. Gordon Prescott occupied the middle seat, one hand resting on a thin file, and presented his part neatly, remaining precisely within what the law allowed him to do. He said that if she cooperated, his office wouldn't prosecute her for anything connected to that night. He made it clear that this was all he could offer. Then the man seated beside him, the Whitmore family's attorney, opened his briefcase and pushed a sheet of paper across the table toward Delilah. It contained other things. A civil settlement large enough that she would never have to work another night shift, the full cost of her mother's residence at Glenmore for the rest of her life. And on the final line, written as neatly as though it were merely an additional expense, the complete cost of surgery and rehabilitation for Delilah's left leg at a hospital in Boston, along with the surgeon's name and the anticipated length of her hospital stay. Prescott turned his face toward the window as the paper slid across the table. Delilah read that final line 3 times. She had stopped thinking about it a very long time ago. Stopped in the way people stopped thinking about places they knew they would never visit. She had looked up the cost of that operation exactly once, late one night after work, then shut down the computer and never opened the page again. Now it lay on the table before her, clearly typed, only one signature away. She remained silent for a long while. She thought about the long route through the kitchen. She thought about standing on 2 legs. Then she asked what they wanted. The Whitmore family's attorney replied that they needed only one statement, a statement declaring that Salvatore Cardinale had given the order, that she had known in advance he was coming, that everything which happened that night had been arranged. He added that if she refused, the plaintiffs would pursue the lawsuit to the end, that with the records already published in the newspaper, the outcome wasn't difficult to predict, and that once she could no longer afford the payments, Glenmore would notify her that her mother's residence would be terminated within 1 month. Delilah placed the paper on the table. She looked at Prescott. then at the man seated beside him, and said aloud what she had just understood, that these two offers should never have been allowed to sit in the same room. That afternoon, Delilah went to Glenmore. Leaning on her new crutch, she made her way down the second-floor corridor, moving faster than usual, so quickly that the nurse on duty turned to watch her pass. At the nurse's station, while Delilah signed the visitor's register, the nurse spoke in the cheerful voice of someone praising a patient for being sensible. She said Mrs. Rourke had been very cooperative lately, that she had asked to have her medication reduced several months earlier, and that she had also requested an end to her physical therapy sessions because she said she no longer felt they were necessary. The nurse said it was rare for a family member to take that kind of initiative. Delilah stood at the desk, with the pen still in her hand, and asked which month it had begun. The nurse gave her a date, and Delilah immediately recognized the month. It was the month when she had sat at the kitchen table in her Olneyville apartment and called the bank twice, speaking rather loudly because the connection was poor. Her mother had been listening from the other end of a separate call that Delilah had left on speaker. Delilah entered the room. Eileen was sitting upright against her pillows with an oxygen mask over her face, and she watched her daughter come in, then looked at the new crutch, and reached up to remove the mask so she could speak. Delilah told her not to take it off. She removed it anyway. She said she knew Delilah had already heard. She said she hadn't meant to hide it. She simply hadn't found a way to tell her. Then she continued, slowly, stopping midway to catch her breath, and said what she had carried inside herself for years. She said that on the night of the fire, she had screamed at Delilah not to go back inside. She said she had screamed until her voice was gone, but Delilah hadn't listened. She said that from that day forward, she had lived at the cost of her daughter's leg, that every morning she woke in this room was another day spent from that leg, and that she had counted and calculated it over and over again, without ever finding a way to make it fair. She said she had only wanted to spend it a little more slowly. Delilah sat on the edge of the bed. She took her mother's hand, a hand that had grown so much thinner since the night Delilah had carried her halfway down the stairs, and she said aloud what she had never said to anyone in all those years. She said she had gone back inside because she wanted to. She said she had been old enough to make her own decision, and she had made it, and she had never asked to take that decision back. She said enough people had spent years telling her she was a burden. They had told her with words, by assigning her to the night shift, by showing her the long route through the kitchen, and she had heard every one of them. Then she said the final words very softly. "Please, Mama, don't be the last person to tell me that." Eileen said nothing for a long while. She looked down at the hand her daughter was using to hold hers, the uninjured hand, then looked toward the other one and said nothing about it. They sat together in silence. Outside the window, the snow covering the lawn had begun to turn gray as evening approached, and the sound of a cart passing through the corridor drifted into the room. Then Eileen spoke, and her voice had changed completely, becoming lighter, almost the voice of someone searching for another subject to ease the weight of the moment. She asked whether Delilah remembered her friend from the kitchen long ago. Back when Delilah was little, when her mother still worked downstairs, Delilah used to sit in the staff room doing her homework while she waited for her mother's shift to end. She asked whether Delilah remembered the woman who had placed her hand on the piano keys and taught her the first few notes. Delilah turned and looked at her mother. "Of course I remember. I just never knew her name." Delilah asked her mother what the woman's name had been. Eileen thought for a moment, not because she had forgotten, but because it had been so many years since she had spoken that name aloud. Then she said it. Rosaria. On the drive back to Barrington, Delilah sat in the rear seat without saying a word. She stared straight ahead, her hand tightly gripping the leather-covered handle of the crutch, resting lengthwise beside her leg. The moment the car stopped, she opened the door. She didn't remove her coat. She walked straight through the foyer and into the living room, crossed to the corner beside the inner wall, and pulled away the covering. The cloth fell to the floor. She placed her uninjured hand on the piano lid and raised it. Inside the lid, carved into the inner surface where only someone opening the piano would ever see it, was a line cut by hand with an ordinary tool. The marks uneven, some deep and others shallow, 2 initials and a year. The year was so far in the past that Delilah had to count backward before she could believe it. She stood there for a very long time, with one hand holding the lid, and she didn't touch the keys. Sal stood in the living room doorway. He had been there since the moment she pulled away the cloth. He didn't enter. When she turned to look at him, he began to speak. And he told the story briefly, in the voice of a man recounting something so old that there was nowhere left for the pain to go. He said the piano had belonged to his mother alone. She had bought it from a church in Pawtucket when they cleared out their belongings, paid for it with her own money, and couldn't bring it home because there hadn't been enough room in their apartment. So she kept it in the staff room in the basement of the Renfield Club, played it during the breaks between her shifts, and left it there throughout all the years she worked in that kitchen. Then he told the rest. He said that on the day she was dismissed, no one called her upstairs to speak with her. There was no farewell. Someone taped a notice to her locker door in the changing room, a printed form with a blank space left for her name, and she read it while she was still wearing her apron. She gathered her belongings and left through the back door. She couldn't take the piano with her. 3 days later, it was lying in the garbage area behind the kitchen, with its lid forced open, and several of the upper keys broken because they had dragged it over the threshold. Sal said he had been very young then, and he had borrowed a small truck and brought it home. Delilah asked what Table 12 meant. Sal said it wasn't the anniversary of his mother's death. It was the day she had been dismissed. He said that for all these years, on that exact date, he had reserved the finest table in the Renfield Club dining room, the table beside the south window, and had gone there to sit alone. He ate nothing. He ordered a dish she used to prepare, left it untouched until it grew cold, then went home. He did it so that for one night each year, someone bearing the Cardinale name would sit inside the room his mother had never been permitted to enter, even though she had stood just behind that wall for so many years. Then he told her the final part, the part Delilah hadn't expected. He said the previous year had been the last time. He had decided to stop. He had spent all those years searching across the state for the unfinished thing his mother had left behind, and had never found it, and he was tired. He had gone there on that November night, intending to sit at the table one final time, then let it end forever. He said he had planned never to return to that building again. That night, Delilah had carried dishes to the table beside his. She remained silent for a long while. Then she lowered the piano lid slowly and rested her hand on the wood. It took Ruth Feingold 4 days to trace what she called the knot, and when she returned to Barrington, she didn't open her briefcase immediately. She sat down, looked at Sal, and asked whether he was certain he wanted to hear it. Then she told him. The money frozen when the Renfield Club was sealed didn't belong to the Whitmore family. It merely passed through them. Their construction company accepted contracts, issued invoices, then transferred the money through a shell company registered in Cranston, and that company had existed on paper for years, without an office, without employees, with only one person authorizing the transactions each month. Ruth placed the paper bearing that person's name on the table. Sal stared at it for a very long time. He said nothing. Frank Delvecchio had been laundering money through that building for all those years, and Sal hadn't known. On the night Sal ordered the iron gates of the Renfield Club torn down, on the morning he made the calls that placed sealing tape across the 2 wooden doors. He had struck directly at his own family's money without realizing it, and the man who had risen before the council to speak about the waitress on a crutch had been the only person in the room who knew exactly what had happened. Ruth wasn't finished. She turned to the next page and said she had spoken to several people from the former Human Resources Department. Camille Whitmore and Delvecchio had known each other for a long time, in the way 2 people sharing the same stream of money had to know one another. And the treatment records Delilah had personally copied page by page and submitted hadn't reached the outside world through the newspaper's own channels. They had left the drawer in the Human Resources office, passed through Camille's hands into Delvecchio's, and only then reached the newspaper. Ruth closed her briefcase and said she was sorry she had to be the one to bring him this news. Sal remained silent for a while, then asked for the name of the editor who had approved the article. That evening, at his apartment on the east side, the editor received a large envelope delivered by a man in a black coat who placed it directly in his hands and left at once. There was no spoken message. No one waited in the hallway. The envelope contained 3 things. The first was a copy of his own debt records from 3 different places, complete with dates and amounts, obligations he had carefully concealed from the outside world for a very long time. The second was the foreclosure, notice the bank had sent him at the beginning of the season, the one he hadn't answered. The third was a signed check with the amount left blank, drawn from Salvatore Cardinale's personal account, enough to take care of the first 2 things and nothing more. With them was a small handwritten note containing 2 words, "You choose." The editor sat at his kitchen table with the 3 papers spread before him until nearly dawn. No one called him. No one came to knock on his door a second time. That was the part that kept him from sleeping, because if there had been a threat, He could at least have told himself that he had been forced. The correction appeared on the front page the following morning, clearly stating that the newspaper had used private medical records obtained through improper means, with an apology to Mrs. Delilah Rourke printed directly beneath the headline. At the end of that week, the editor submitted his resignation. He left Providence at the beginning of spring, whole, unharmed, and wealthier than when he had arrived. In Barrington, Delilah picked up the newspaper, read the apology twice, then set it down. She asked Sal what he had done. Sal said he had merely given someone a choice no one had ever given them before. Delilah spent the entire evening rereading the file Ruth had left on the table, studying it carefully, the way she had always studied the shift schedule, and near dawn she understood something very simple. This case wasn't aimed at the Whitmore family. The Whitmores were already finished. What Gordon Prescott's office wanted lay somewhere else, and the only thing connecting the man who had come for her to that night was Delilah herself. As long as she remained in this house, as long as her name appeared beside his on any piece of paper, she would remain the sharpest weapon the other side held in its hand. She didn't think about whether she deserved anything or didn't deserve it. She thought about taking that knife out of their hands. The following morning, she folded her clothes into a small pile, wrote a brief letter, and left it on the table. And before departing, she placed the new crutch neatly across the carefully smoothed bed. She took the old crutch from the corner of the closet, run with the long scratch along its aluminum shaft, and left through the side door. He found her at Glenmore late that afternoon. She was sitting on a plastic chair in the second-floor corridor beside the door to her mother's room, because Eileen's tube was being changed, and the staff had asked Delilah to wait outside. She heard the footsteps and knew who it was before she looked up. Sal said nothing. He didn't remain standing there looking down at her. He lowered himself onto the corridor floor, leaned his back against the tiled wall, stretched his legs out before him, and sat there at the level of her eyes, a man in an expensive suit sitting on the floor of a hallway that smelled of antiseptic while carts rolled past. He placed something he had brought from Barrington beside the wall, the crutch she had left on the bed. He propped it against the wall beside her and didn't say a word about it. Then he began to speak. He said he had spent all those years searching for the Rourke family. He had searched old directories, hospitals, and the neighborhoods where kitchen workers had rented rooms in those days. He had searched across the entire state. He said he had looked everywhere except the one place that had swallowed his mother, because he couldn't believe anyone would willingly enter that building again. He said he had given up. Then he said he had never imagined Delilah would walk into that building on her own, enter through the back door, and remain there for 2 seasons. He told her she hadn't taken anything from him. He said she was the first thing he had ever truly had. Delilah remained silent for a while. Then she asked the question she had carried inside herself since that night in the corridor. She asked what kind of man he was. She said she didn't want the comforting answer, that she had heard enough comforting answers in her life, that she wanted the truth. Sal looked directly at her. He said he wasn't a good man. Then he said he had never harmed anyone who couldn't fight back, and that if she wanted him to become a different man, she would have to give him time. The corridor remained silent for a long while after that. Then came the sound of her mother's door opening, followed by the nurse calling out that they were finished, and Delilah could come inside. Delilah pressed one hand against the chair and rose. She reached out and took the crutch, leaning against the wall beside her, the new one with the leather-covered handle. She said nothing about it. Neither did he. He stood, brushed off his sleeves, and followed her into the room. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed directly to Mrs. Eileen Rourke, and someone placed it on her breakfast tray. Delilah read it in the corridor while leaning against the wall, reading it twice before she understood what it meant. The corporation managing Glenmore announced that because of facility restructuring, several rooms on the second floor would be taken out of service, and the families of the affected patients would need to collect them within 1 business day. One day, in the middle of February, she called the administrative office, and they told her the decision had come from above, that they were very sorry. She asked who had made the decision. They couldn't answer. It took Ruth Feingold less than half a day to trace it. The corporation had a major shareholder based in Cranston, and the name listed on that shareholder's documents was the same name she had placed on the table in Barrington several days earlier. Ruth told Sal plainly that this wasn't an attack on the elderly woman. It was an attack on Delilah's signature. Once she had nowhere left to place her mother, she would sit down with Prescott and sign that paper before the end of the week. Sal listened to everything, then asked Ruth how much it would cost to transfer a patient like Eileen to Boston. place her in the finest respiratory care unit money could buy, and keep her there permanently. Ruth gave him the figure. Then she added that he had nothing left to draw from, that after the meeting in Federal Hill, every shared source of money had been closed to him, and that she was telling him this as his attorney, not because she wished to interfere. Sal told her to prepare the paperwork. That afternoon, Gino drove him down to the harbor. They entered the low red brick office building beside Pier 4, the building Sal had first walked into before he was old enough to sign a contract, and he remained inside for nearly 2 hours with 3 buyers. When he emerged, his entire ownership stake there no longer belonged to him. The cargo handling contracts, the warehouses, the right to sit at the head of the table in rooms paneled with walnut, everything he had built year by year since the winter he brought the piano home, he sold it all in a single afternoon, and because he sold in haste, he sold it cheaply. He said nothing during the drive back. Gino didn't ask, but Gino knew exactly what had happened, knew every figure involved, and when they stopped at a red light on Allen's Avenue, he glanced over, saw Sal staring through the window toward the cranes, and turned his face away. Gino told no one, not the other men, not Ruth, and certainly not Delilah. The following morning, a fully equipped ambulance arrived at Glenmore. Eileen was carried out beneath warm blankets with 2 nurses accompanying her, taken directly to Boston, and admitted to a unit Delilah hadn't even known existed. They gave Delilah a small room next door where she could stay overnight if she wished. Delilah stood in the corridor of the new hospital, looking through the glass into her mother's room, and asked Sal how much it had cost. He didn't answer. He only said that from now on, her mother would no longer be an expense line on anyone's spreadsheet. Then he told her to go inside. Her mother was waiting. Ruth had submitted the witness list to the court at the beginning of the week, and Otis Brennan's name appeared on it in the 3rd line. The night before the hearing, someone broke into his small house in Silver Lake. He returned while the intruder was still there, opened the front door, and found someone in the living room. The intruder shoved him aside while running for the exit, and Otis fell against the stair railing. A neighbor called an ambulance. At the hospital, he was diagnosed with a fractured hip. Nothing had been taken from the house. No money, no possessions. Only the bottom drawer of the cabinet at the foot of the stairs had been pulled out and left empty. The hardbound notebook he had kept for all those years was gone. Ruth called Sal near midnight and told him that without the notebook, all they would have by morning was the testimony of a woman whose entire treatment history had been published in the newspaper. Sal arrived at the hospital early in the morning, before all the corridor lights had been turned on. Otis lay on his side with one leg elevated, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw was a man dressed in black, sitting in the chair beside the bed. He didn't know who the man was. He assumed Sal had come from the court. Sal didn't introduce himself. He asked Otis what was written on the first page of the notebook. Otis remained silent for a while. Then he told him. He said the first page contained only a name and a date. It was the name of a woman who worked in the kitchen, a dishwasher on the afternoon shift, and the date was the day she had been dismissed with a printed notice, taped to her locker door in the changing room. He said he had been there that day. He had stood at the end of the corridor and watched her read the notice, and he hadn't stepped forward. He said that when he returned home that evening, he found a notebook in a drawer and wrote down her name because he believed there should be at least one place in the world where what had happened was recorded. Then he continued writing. One person, then another, who had been dismissed, who had been berated in the middle of the dining room, who had fallen in the storeroom only for the incident report to disappear the following day. He said he wrote it all down because he knew no one would believe people like them, the people who entered through the back door, and he had intended to keep it only for himself. He had never imagined anyone would someday ask for it. Sal asked him about the night of the snowstorm. Otis turned his face away. He said that before his shift began that afternoon, the owner's son had come down to the guard booth and told him to go home. He had said the storm was too severe, that Otis was old, and that driving at night would be dangerous. Otis said it was the first time in all those years that anyone in that family had cared about how he would get home. He had thanked the young man. Then he had gone home, drunk his tea, and gone to bed. He hadn't learned what happened until the following morning. He said he hadn't slept through a single night since. Sal sat in silence. Then he spoke the name written on the notebook's first page, saying her full name clearly. Otis turned and looked at him. He asked how Sal knew. Sal said, "I'm her son." Otis Brennan lay there at 63 years old, one leg elevated on pillows, and began to cry. For a long while, he couldn't speak. Sal didn't offer him a handkerchief, didn't place a hand on his shoulder, didn't say anything to make him stop crying. He simply sat there and waited. When Otis had finally calmed, Sal rose, straightened the front of his coat, and before leaving, told him that all these years, Otis had written down everyone else's name, but no one had ever written down his. Then he said, "From now on I will." Delilah heard Ruth recount what had happened at the hospital at nearly 9 o'clock that evening, and afterward she remained silent for a very long time, not because she had lost hope, but because something inside her mind was struggling to rise to the surface and hadn't yet managed to reach it. It was hidden in what Otis had told Sal about the first page. The first page contained Rosaria's name. That meant he had begun writing on the day she was dismissed. That meant no one had been recording anything before that day. Then Delilah remembered something her mother had said, not the story about the piano keys, but another sentence Eileen had mentioned in passing that afternoon at Glenmore, one Delilah hadn't noticed at the time. Her mother had said that her friend used to sit in the staff room writing things down, and that the people in the kitchen had teased her by calling her the teacher. Delilah sat upright. Otis hadn't begun it, he had only continued it, and if Rosaria had been writing before him, she must have hidden her records somewhere, and in that entire building, throughout all her years working there, she had possessed only one thing that belonged entirely to her. Delilah returned to Barrington near midnight. None of the main lights were on. She didn't remove her coat or call for anyone. Leaning on her crutch, she crossed the foyer, entered the living room, went to the corner beside the inner wall, and stood before the piano for a while. Then she rested her crutch against its side, bent down, and lifted the top of the piano bench. The bench had a storage compartment. It was filled with paper. She removed the stacks one by one and spread them across the floor, then lowered herself among them and began to read. Some pages had yellowed so badly that the ink had blurred. Others had been torn from notebooks. There were even pieces of bread wrapping paper with pencil writing on the inside. Dates, names, shifts. This person had been humiliated in the dining room in front of the guests. That person had been dismissed for being too slow. A kitchen assistant had slipped in the cold storage room, and when she asked about it the following day, the report was gone. An elderly security guard had lost part of his wages because he fell asleep after standing for 14 hours. Some names appeared again and again over many years, then vanished. And beside the place where each disappeared was a line noting the date that person had left. More than 20 years lay inside that wooden compartment. No one in the world had thought to search the bench of a piano that had once been dragged out to the garbage behind the kitchen. Delilah read until her eyes could no longer make out the words. At the very bottom, pressed between 2 sheets of thick paper, was a photograph. She turned it over. 2 women in aprons stood beside each other, one with dark hair and the other with lighter hair, both smiling, and seated on the piano bench in front of them was a little girl of about 8, her hair tied crookedly to one side, both hands resting on the keys, smiling so broadly that her eyes were squeezed shut. Behind them stood the blue painted wall of the staff room. Delilah recognized her mother immediately. Then she recognized the other woman. She turned the photograph over. On the back was a line written in pencil, the handwriting slightly slanted, formed by the hand of someone more accustomed to wiping dishes than holding a pencil. Delilah, the little girl who can play with both hands. She sat there for a very long time with the photograph in her hand. Then she set it down, used her crutch to rise, and pulled out the bench. She placed all the papers neatly to one side. She sat down. She opened the piano lid, and this time, she didn't close it again. Her left hand rested motionless in her lap, where it had remained for so many years. She raised her right hand to the keys. She played the first few notes incorrectly. She stopped, breathed, then began again from the beginning. And in that dark room, alone among more than 20 years of records spread across the floor, Delilah Rourke played with one hand the only piece she could still remember, the piece a woman in an apron had taught her long ago in the basement, after placing Delilah's hands upon the keys. Sal didn't need anyone to tell him. He had known from the moment Ruth called at midnight and said the bottom drawer had been pulled out and left empty, because in the entire state there was only one person who both knew that Otis Brennan's name appeared in the 3rd line of the witness list and had a reason to ensure that notebook was never opened in court. Sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, Sal's men found Frank Del Vecchio inside a closed restaurant on Atwells Avenue and brought him to warehouse number 7 at the harbor, the warehouse Sal had just sold along with everything else. Though the new owners had still allowed him to keep the key, Gino stood by the door. He had followed Frank Del Vecchio for many years before he began following Salvatore Cardinale, and he was the only person that night who could see both ends of what was about to happen. He knew that if it happened inside this warehouse, the entire family would be divided in two by morning. He knew which side every man would take, and he knew the man caught in the middle wouldn't live to see the end of the year. So he went outside, stood out of sight behind a shipping container, and made a call. Then he sent a car to bring someone. Delilah arrived while the sky was still dark. The warehouse door had been raised halfway, and the wind blew directly in from the bay, carrying the smell of machine oil and brackish water. Inside, a few bulbs hanging from the rafters cast a dim light. At the far end, nearly the full length of the warehouse from where she stood, there was a wooden chair, and Frank Del Vecchio sat upon it with his coat draped across his lap. His silver hair disordered by the wind, Salvatore Cardinale stood before him. Delilah began to walk. The warehouse floor was rough concrete, and the rubber tip of her crutch struck it with a small, dry sound, followed by her right foot, then the dragging of her left. Those three sounds repeated themselves through the empty warehouse, rising toward the rafters and returning from the sheet metal walls. And apart from the wind, they were the only sounds anyone could hear. No one called to her. No one told her to stop. She passed stacks of wooden pallets, crossed through the pool of light beneath the first bulb, entered the darkness again, then emerged beneath the second. She moved very slowly. It took her so long that Del Vecchio looked up when she was only halfway across the warehouse, and from that moment on, he never took his eyes off her. Sal heard the crutch long before she reached him, but he didn't turn around. She stopped about 3 steps behind him. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She waited until her breathing became steady. Then she spoke. She said his mother had stood washing dishes in that kitchen for all those years, working the afternoon shift, standing there until the day someone taped a notice to her locker door, and that she had done all of it, so her son wouldn't become the kind of man standing in this room at 2 o'clock in the morning. She said that if he did what he intended to do tonight, she would still be vindicated by morning. She would still have the notebook. She would still have the papers hidden inside the piano bench. She would still win. But his mother would lose. She would lose on the very night when someone had finally learned her name. Then, Delilah spoke the final sentence very softly, so softly that the wind nearly swallowed it. She said, "I didn't come all this way to watch her lose." No one inside the warehouse spoke. Del Vecchio remained motionless in the chair, staring at the floor. Gino stood outside the door and didn't come in. Sal remained there for a very long time, long enough for Delilah to hear the water striking the wooden pilings beyond the pier. Then he lowered his hand. He didn't say a word. He merely turned, walked past her, and headed toward the warehouse door. In all the years he had done this work, it was the first time anyone had ever stopped him, and the person who did it walked with a crutch. That morning, a court attendant pushed a wheelchair all the way to the courtroom door and told Delilah she could sit in it so she wouldn't tire herself. Delilah thanked him and said no. She entered on her own crutch and crossed the full length of the courtroom, from the rear door to the witness stand, passing between 2 rows of wooden benches filled with people. The courtroom floor was terrazzo, and the sound of the rubber tip striking it rang out clearly, followed by her right foot. Then the dragging of her left. No one spoke. No pages turned. No one coughed. No one cleared a throat. There were only those 3 sounds repeating beneath the high ceiling, and they continued far longer than anyone in the room had prepared themselves to hear. When she reached the witness stand, she propped her crutch against its side. Then she raised her right hand and removed the glove from her left, pulling it away 1 finger at a time before placing it on the wooden surface. It was the first time in years that she had exposed that hand in front of other people. She said she was rejecting the settlement. She said she was rejecting the surgery as well. Then she came to the most difficult part, and she said it before anyone had the chance to ask. She admitted that she had signed a statement claiming she had slipped in the storeroom, and that the statement wasn't true. She explained why. She said her mother had needed the bed at Glenmore more than Delilah had needed the truth, that she had chosen the bed, and that if she were forced to make the same choice again on that same morning, she couldn't promise she would choose differently. Ruth's attorney submitted the club's personnel records, the section the court had ordered them to produce. Among those papers was a handwritten note from several years earlier, initialed by the chairwoman of the board herself, instructing Human Resources to hire an applicant with a disability for the night service position. It specifically identified the shift as one involving limited contact with members, and stated that the purpose was to complete the club's compliance records before an upcoming review. Delilah read those words where she stood. Then she understood why no other place in the city had called her back while this one had. Then she understood why they had treated her that way for 2 seasons, without ever dismissing her. Camille Whitmore sat among the witnesses with her hands resting on her purse and her back straight. Delilah turned fully toward her. She didn't address the panel. She didn't address the judge. She looked directly at Camille and said, "All this time, I was grateful because I believed you had given me a job." She paused. Then she continued, "Today I understand that you didn't hire me. You hung me on the wall." The entire room fell silent. Then came the longest part of that morning. The papers from the piano bench were submitted 1 stack at a time, arranged by year. Marisol Vega took the stand, her hands trembling though her voice didn't. Then came 3 more people, former employees who had left long ago and whom no one had imagined still lived in the city. Then more followed. Throughout those 2 hours, the name Rosaria Cardinale was spoken aloud in court again and again, slowly and in full, and Camille Whitmore had to sit and listen from beginning to end. Near noon, Gordon Prescott closed the file before him and requested an adjournment so his office could reconsider the direction of its prosecution. By that afternoon, the lawsuit against Delilah Rourke had been withdrawn. In the corridor outside, Prescott stopped Sal. He said he wasn't letting him go, that he was merely taking the others first. Sal studied him for a moment, then asked what his mother had done for a living. Prescott fell silent. Then he said she had cleaned hotel rooms in Newport for all those years. Sal nodded and said, "Then you're doing the right thing." Frank Del Vecchio confessed to everything within 3 weeks. He testified about the shell company in Cranston, about the money that had flowed through the Whitmore family's construction company for all those years, and he provided such complete detail that the prosecutor's office had no need to search for anything more. And in the eyes of the law, the head of an organization was responsible for whatever happened in that organization's name, even for the things he hadn't known about. Ruth Feingold explained this to Sal in the conference room on the 4th floor, and she told him plainly that he needed to give them only one statement. He had only to say that he had known nothing about it, and identify the man who had actually operated the flow of money, and his sentence would be entirely different. Sal remained silent for a very long time. Then he told her to negotiate. He accepted a deal for more than a year, and he never told anyone why he refused to testify. Delilah won her lawsuit. During the liquidation of the Whitmore family's assets, her compensation was settled by transferring ownership of the only property the bank hadn't seized, the building itself on Benefit Street. She was paid with the very place that had forced her to take the long route through the kitchen for 2 seasons. Sal gave her nothing. Before entering the correctional facility, he transferred only 2 things to her: the old piano from the living room in Barrington, and every paper found inside its bench. The first work Delilah ordered for the building wasn't repainting the walls. She had the stone steps at the front removed and replaced with a ramp, had an elevator installed in the old atrium shaft, and had every doorway in the building widened, including the door leading to the basement. She gave the contractor only one instruction: in this building, no one will ever have to take the long way through the kitchen again. It opened that fall as the Rosaria Community Music School, with free tuition for the children of shift workers, servers, kitchen assistants, custodians, and drivers. In the foyer stood a large brass plaque engraved with every name found among Rosaria's papers and in Otis's notebook, arranged by year, with no one omitted. Otis Brennan became the head of security. He walked with a cane, and he knew the name of every child who came to study. At the opening ceremony, Delilah sat at the old piano in the center of the foyer. A young student sat beside her, her feet not yet reaching the floor, and they played together, the little girl performing the left-hand part while Delilah played the right. 2 people sharing one piece of music. The entire foyer erupted in applause, and the girl smiled until her eyes closed as she turned toward the crowd to find her mother. Delilah's crutch stood beside the piano bench, hidden from no one. Eileen sat in the front row, far healthier than she had been the previous winter. Then, on a winter morning the following year, a thin layer of snow covered the ground outside the gates of a correctional facility in the northern part of the state. A car waited beside the road with its engine still running. Delilah stood leaning against the door, supported by her crutch, the collar of her coat raised against the wind. The gates opened, and Salvatore Cardinale walked out with empty hands. He stopped when he saw her. She smiled at him. "I came to get you. Some stories don't teach us anything new." They only remind us of what we once knew and somehow forgot. That the way a person treats someone serving them reveals exactly who they are, more precisely than anything they could ever say about themselves. That a scar isn't something for which anyone should have to apologize. It is proof that someone made it through. That people don't need pity. They need only a place left open for them to enter, and someone willing to ask their name. And that no one in this world should ever have to apologize for their own existence. If the story of Delilah and Salvatore touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you care about. How did today's story make you feel? And what part will remain with you the longest? Please leave a comment, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.